It was December 16, 1980. An old man lay still in a Louisville hospital bed, his famous white suit hanging untouched in a closet nearby. His goatee had grown thin. His hands, which had once perfected the most famous fried chicken recipe in the world, rested quietly at his sides. Colonel Sanders, the face of Kentucky Fried Chicken, was dying. He had been diagnosed with leukemia 6 months earlier, but even then, he refused to stop. He kept appearing at restaurants, kept shaking hands, kept wearing that iconic white suit until his body simply could not carry him any longer. Outside the hospital, the world was preparing for Christmas, but inside room 412, there was only silence and the steady beep of machines. His wife Claudia sat beside him, holding the same hand that had once signed franchise agreements across America, the same hand that had pulled their family out of poverty and into legend. When he passed that cold December morning, the news traveled fast. Flags across Kentucky dropped to half-staff. The governor ordered his body to lie in state at the Capitol Rotunda, an honor usually reserved for politicians and war heroes. But Harlan Sanders was something different. He was a man who had failed more times than most people ever try, who had been broke at 65, and who had turned a pressure cooker and 11 secret herbs and spices into a global empire. Yet the true heart of his story was not in boardrooms or television commercials. It was not even in the thousands of red and white restaurants that bore his image. The true heart of Harlan Sanders lived in a quiet Kentucky town called Shelbyville, inside a mansion called Blackwood Hall. This is the story of that house, the dreams it held, the empire it built, and the legacy it still protects today. A boy without a father. To understand the man who would one day build an empire from fried chicken, we must first understand the boy who learned to cook out of necessity, not choice. Harlan David Sanders was born on September 9, 1890, in a small 4-room farmhouse near Henryville, Indiana. His father, Wilbur Sanders, worked an 80-acre farm, struggling to provide for his wife Margaret and their 3 children. Life was simple but hard. The soil was unforgiving, the winters brutal, and money always tight. Then, when Harlan was just 5 years old, tragedy struck. Wilbur Sanders fell ill and died, leaving Margaret alone with 3 young children and almost nothing to her name. Suddenly, the weight of survival fell on the small shoulders of a boy who should have been playing in the fields. Margaret took work at a tomato canning factory and sewed clothes for neighboring families, often disappearing for days at a time. In her absence, young Harlan became the caretaker of his younger brother and sister. He cleaned, he watched over them, and most importantly, he cooked. By the age of 7, Harlan Sanders could prepare a full meal from scratch. He learned to stretch ingredients, to make something from almost nothing, to feed hungry mouths with whatever the pantry offered. It was not a gift. It was survival. Those early years planted a seed that would take decades to bloom. The kitchen became his classroom, and necessity became his greatest teacher. The wandering years. When Harlan turned 10, he took his first job working on a nearby farm, earning just $4 a month plus room and board. School became an afterthought. By the time he was 12, his mother remarried, bringing the children to live with a stepfather in Indianapolis. But the relationship was poisonous from the start. Harlan and his stepfather clashed constantly, their arguments growing louder and more violent with each passing month. Finally, at 13, Harlan was sent away to live and work on a farm in Clark County. His formal education ended in the 7th grade. He would never return to school again. What followed was a wandering life that seemed to have no direction. Over the next 30 years, Harlan Sanders held more jobs than most people could count. He worked as a farmhand, feeding livestock before dawn and collapsing into sleep after dark. He became a streetcar conductor in Indianapolis, collecting fares and learning the rhythm of the city. At 16, he lied about his age and enlisted in the United States Army, serving briefly in Cuba before receiving an honorable discharge. After the Army, he worked as a railroad fireman, shoveling coal into steam engines that roared across the American heartland. He tried his hand at being a blacksmith, a tire salesman, a ferryboat operator, and an insurance agent. He even studied law through a correspondence course and practiced briefly in Arkansas, only to destroy his legal career in a courtroom brawl with his own client. Failure followed him like a shadow. Jobs came and went. Money slipped through his fingers. His first marriage, to Josephine King in 1908, produced 3 children but crumbled under the weight of constant relocations and financial stress. His son, Harlan Jr., died at just 20 years old from blood poisoning following a routine tonsillectomy. The grief nearly broke him. By his mid-40s, Harlan Sanders had experienced enough tragedy and disappointment to fill several lifetimes. And yet, the chapter that would define him had not even begun. The gas station that changed everything. In 1930, at the age of 40, Harlan Sanders arrived in Corbin, Kentucky. The Great Depression was tightening its grip on America. Factories were closing, banks were failing, families were losing their homes. But Harlan saw something different in Corbin. He saw opportunity. He took over a Shell service station along U.S. Route 25, the main north-south highway running through the Appalachian region. Travelers passed through constantly, their automobiles thirsty for fuel and their stomachs growling for food. Most gas stations offered neither comfort nor hospitality. Harlan decided to change that. In the back room of the service station, he set up his own dining table, seating just 6 customers at a time. He cooked the meals himself, serving steaks, country ham, and of course, fried chicken. The recipes were his own, honed over decades of cooking for his family and anyone else who would eat. Word spread quickly. Locals began stopping by not for gasoline but for food. Travelers detoured from their routes just to taste what this strange, energetic man was serving in his tiny dining room. By 1937, his reputation had grown so large that he built a proper restaurant across the street, the Sanders Cafe, with seating for 142 guests. A motel soon followed, offering weary travelers a place to rest after their meal. Business boomed. The Sanders Cafe became a landmark along Route 25, drawing customers from across the state. Then came the recognition. In 1935, Kentucky Governor Ruby LaFoon bestowed upon Harlan Sanders the honorary title of Kentucky Colonel, recognizing his contributions to the state's cuisine. It was a largely ceremonial honor given to outstanding citizens, but Sanders embraced it fully. He began calling himself Colonel Sanders, adopting a new persona that would eventually become one of the most recognizable images in the world. He grew a goatee, traded his work clothes for a white suit, and added a black string tie. The transformation was complete. By 1939, the restaurant was doing so well that the legendary food critic Duncan Hines, yes, the same Duncan Hines whose name now graces cake mixes across America, visited and included the Sanders Cafe in his influential guidebook, Adventures in Good Eating. The review brought even more customers, and the Colonel's fame spread beyond Kentucky's borders. Everything seemed perfect. Harlan Sanders, after decades of failure and wandering, had finally found success. He had a thriving business, a growing reputation, and a future that looked brighter than ever. But fate was not finished with him yet. The road that destroyed everything. In the early 1950s, the United States government announced plans for a new interstate highway system. The idea was revolutionary, a network of high-speed roads connecting every corner of the nation. For most Americans, it represented progress, convenience, and the promise of a more connected country. For Harlan Sanders, it represented disaster. The planned route for Interstate 75 would bypass Corbin entirely. The same highway that had brought thousands of hungry travelers past his front door would now carry them miles away, never even knowing his restaurant existed. The lifeblood of his business, the steady stream of customers who stopped for gas and stayed for chicken, would simply vanish. Sanders watched helplessly as construction crews began their work in the mid-50s. He knew what was coming. He could see the future written in every mile of fresh asphalt. By 1956, the situation had become untenable. Traffic to his restaurant dropped steadily. The motel rooms sat empty. The kitchen that once hummed with activity grew quiet. At 65 years old, the age when most Americans were collecting their first Social Security checks and settling into retirement, Harlan Sanders was forced to sell his business at auction. When the final hammer fell, he barely made enough to cover his debts. After paying off his mortgage and outstanding bills, he was left with almost nothing. His monthly income consisted of a single Social Security check for $105. Most men would have accepted defeat. Most men would have found a quiet corner to spend their remaining years, nursing their regrets and watching the world pass by. But Harlan Sanders was not most men. He packed his car with a pressure cooker, his secret blend of 11 herbs and spices, and his Kentucky Colonel certificate. Then he drove out of Corbin with nothing but a dream that most people would have called foolish. The man in the white suit. Picture an old man in a white suit, driving alone through the back roads of Kentucky in the late 1950s. He has no appointment, no business card, no company behind him, just a recipe in his head and a pressure cooker in his trunk. This was Harlan Sanders at 65, beginning the most unlikely chapter of his life. His plan was simple but audacious. He would visit restaurants across the country, cook his fried chicken for the owners and their staff, and if they liked it, negotiate a franchise deal. In exchange for using his recipe and his name, they would pay him 5 cents for every piece of chicken they sold. It was not a sophisticated business model. There were no lawyers, no contracts, no corporate infrastructure, just a handshake and a promise. The first months were brutal. Restaurant owners slammed doors in his face. They laughed at this old man in his ridiculous white suit, this self-proclaimed colonel who wanted a nickel for every chicken leg. Sanders slept in the back of his car, washed up in gas station bathrooms, and ate the cheapest meals he could find. His wife Claudia sometimes traveled with him, sharing the cramped quarters and the endless rejections. But he refused to quit. He had spent his entire life failing and getting back up. This was just one more challenge, one more obstacle to overcome. And slowly, impossibly, his persistence began to pay off. The first official Kentucky Fried Chicken franchise opened in 1952 in Salt Lake City, Utah, operated by a man named Pete Harmon. Harmon coined the phrase "finger lickin' good" and introduced the now famous paper bucket. The restaurant was an immediate success. Word spread to other restaurant owners. Suddenly, People were calling Sanders instead of the other way around. By 1959, Sanders had more than 200 franchises. By 1963, that number had grown to over 600. Kentucky Fried Chicken was becoming a phenomenon, spreading across America and into Canada. The Colonel's face appeared on every bucket, every advertisement, every storefront. He was no longer just a man. He was becoming a legend. But even as his empire grew, Sanders needed a home. He needed a headquarters. He needed a place to run his operation, to train his franchisees, to store and ship his secret spice blend. And he found exactly what he was looking for in a small Kentucky town with a big Civil War history and an even bigger future. Blackwood Hall. In 1866, just 1 year after the Civil War ended, a stately mansion rose on the outskirts of Shelbyville, Kentucky. The house stood proudly along what is now U.S. Route 60, its white facade gleaming against the rolling green hills of Shelby County. It was called Blackwood Hall, a name reportedly inspired by a Nancy Drew novel, and it carried the quiet elegance of antebellum Kentucky. The mansion was substantial, but not ostentatious. 5,000 square feet spread across 2 stories, with high ceilings, hardwood floors, and windows that captured the soft Kentucky light. A wide porch wrapped around the front, offering views of the property's 3 acres and the countryside beyond. It was the kind of house that whispered of old money and Southern grace. For nearly a century, Blackwood Hall passed through various owners, each leaving their mark on its walls. But it was not until 1959 that the house would find its most famous resident. Harland and Claudia Sanders were looking for a new home. The Corbin chapter of their lives was closed. The interstate had destroyed their restaurant, but their franchise business was growing faster than either of them could have imagined. They needed space, not just for living, but for operations. They needed a headquarters. When they first saw Blackwood Hall, something clicked. The house had history, character, and enough room for both a home and an office. The location was perfect, situated along a major highway with easy access to Louisville and the rest of Kentucky. And there was space behind the main house to build the warehouse and office they desperately needed. They purchased the property and moved in immediately. For Claudia, it was a dream come true. After years of uncertainty, after sleeping in the backs of cars and living out of suitcases, she finally had a real home. For Harland, it was a command center. The franchise empire was growing, and Blackwood Hall became its nerve center. In the building behind the main house, Claudia mixed and packaged the secret blend of 11 herbs and spices that made Kentucky Fried Chicken famous. She filled orders, answered phones, and shipped supplies to franchisees across the country. It was a family operation, run out of a Kentucky mansion by an old man in a white suit and his devoted wife. But Harland Sanders was not content to simply run a business from his new home. He wanted more. He wanted to teach. The kitchen where empires learned. Inside Blackwood Hall, in a modest kitchen that still contained its original stove, something remarkable happened almost every week. Aspiring franchisees traveled from across America to learn the secrets of Kentucky Fried Chicken directly from the Colonel himself. Sanders would stand at that stove, white suit immaculate, string tie perfectly knotted, and demonstrate exactly how his chicken should be prepared. He showed them the proper way to season the bird, how to handle the pressure cooker, how to achieve that perfect golden crust that customers craved. His standards were exacting, his patience was limited, and his language, when things went wrong, could make a sailor blush. But those who survived the Colonel's training left with something invaluable. They had learned directly from the master. They had touched the original equipment. They had stood in the very kitchen where the dream became reality. For franchisees, a visit to Blackwood Hall was a pilgrimage, a chance to connect with the source of their business. The original stove still stands in that kitchen today, a silent witness to thousands of chicken lessons and the birth of a global empire. The sale that changed everything. By 1964, Kentucky Fried Chicken had grown beyond anything Sanders had imagined. More than 600 franchises operated across the United States and Canada. The business was generating millions of dollars, but it was also consuming him. At 73 years old, the Colonel was exhausted. The constant travel, the endless meetings, the pressure of managing such a massive operation had taken their toll. He no longer had the energy to oversee every detail, to visit every restaurant, to maintain the standards he had spent his life perfecting. Then came an offer. A group of investors led by John Y. Brown Jr. and Jack C. Massey approached Sanders with a proposal. They wanted to buy Kentucky Fried Chicken outright. The price was $2 million, roughly $19 million in today's money. In exchange, Sanders would give up control of the company, but remain as its official spokesperson and quality ambassador, earning a salary of $40,000 per year to travel and promote the brand. It was a difficult decision. Kentucky Fried Chicken was his creation, his life's work, the culmination of every failure and every triumph he had ever experienced. But he also knew he could not run it forever. And $2 million would provide security he had never known. Sanders signed the papers and watched as his company became someone else's to manage. He stayed true to his agreement, traveling over 200,000 miles per year, appearing in commercials, visiting restaurants, and representing the brand he had built from nothing. But something had changed. The new owners began cutting corners. They simplified the gravy recipe to save time and money. They altered preparation methods that Sanders considered sacred. And the quality, in the Colonel's mind, began to slip. He did not remain silent. The Colonel's fury. Harlan Sanders had never been a man to hold his tongue. His temper was legendary, his language colorful, and his opinions freely shared with anyone who would listen. When he believed the new owners were ruining his chicken, he made sure the world knew it. In interviews, Sanders described the company's gravy as sludge, with a wallpaper taste. He made unannounced visits to KFC restaurants, and if the food disappointed him, would loudly denounce it as slop, or simply push it onto the floor. He became a thorn in the side of the corporate executives who now controlled his creation. In 1973, Sanders sued Heublein Incorporated, the company that then owned KFC, alleging misuse of his image for products he had not approved. 2 years later, Heublein sued him back for libel after he publicly attacked their gravy. The lawsuit was unsuccessful, but the message was clear. The relationship between the Colonel and his company had soured. Meanwhile, back at Blackwood Hall, Sanders and Claudia hatched a new plan. If KFC would not maintain his standards, he would create something better. In 1968, they converted the warehouse building behind their home into a full-service restaurant. They called it the Colonel's Lady, and it served authentic Kentucky cuisine, including fried chicken made the way Sanders believed it should be made. The new owners of KFC were not pleased. When word reached them that Sanders planned to franchise the Colonel's Lady as a competitor to Kentucky Fried Chicken, their lawyers sprang into action. A lawsuit followed. Threats were exchanged, and eventually a settlement was reached. Sanders received $1 million. The restaurant was renamed Claudia Sanders Dinner House, removing any direct reference to the Colonel. and Sanders agreed to stop publicly criticizing Kentucky Fried Chicken, but only after giving the corporate executives a personal cooking lesson to show them how the chicken should really taste. The renamed restaurant thrived. It served the same Southern comfort food Sanders had been making for decades, prepared with the same care and attention to quality. Locals and travelers alike packed the dining room, drawn by the authentic flavors and the knowledge that they were eating in a place the Colonel himself had built. And through it all, Blackwood Hall remained. The mansion stood watch over the restaurant, over the memories, over a legacy that refused to fade, a love story written in chicken. Behind every great man, they say, stands a great woman. For Harlan Sanders, that woman was Claudia. Their story was not a fairy tale. It was complicated, messy, and very human. Sanders had met Claudia Leddington in the 1930s when she worked as a waitress at his Sanders Cafe in Corbin. At the time, he was still married to Josephine, his first wife and the mother of his 3 children. But the marriage had grown cold. Josephine, worn down by years of constant moves and financial struggles, had emotionally withdrawn from her husband. Claudia was different. She was warm, willing, and supportive in ways Josephine had stopped being. An affair began, one that would eventually end Sanders's first marriage. In 1947, after 39 years together, Harlan and Josephine divorced. 2 years later, in 1949, Harlan and Claudia were married in Corbin. Whatever the circumstances of their beginning, Claudia became the partner Sanders needed. She believed in him when the world dismissed him as a foolish old man. She slept beside him in the back of cars during those desperate early franchise years. She mixed spices and filled orders and answered phones at Blackwood Hall. She was not just his wife. She was his business partner, his confidant, his rock. When Sanders built the restaurant behind their home, he named it for her. Claudia Sanders' dinner house was his gift to the woman who had given him everything. It was her monument, her legacy, a testament to the partnership that had built an empire. The Colonel in his castle. By the 1970s, Harlan Sanders had become one of the most recognized faces on earth. His image appeared on every KFC bucket, every advertisement, every storefront from Louisville to London to Tokyo. He had become a living logo, a human brand, a symbol that transcended the food he had created. But at Blackwood Hall, he was simply Harlan. He was a man who still loved to cook, who still believed that the right amount of pressure and the right blend of spices could transform an ordinary meal into something magical. He was a husband who adored his wife, a philanthropist who donated millions to children's hospitals and charities, and a perfectionist who could never accept anything less than excellence. The mansion reflected his personality. It was comfortable, but not extravagant. Well-appointed, but not showy. The rooms held memorabilia from his remarkable life, certificates and awards and photographs of the journey from poverty to global fame. His Bible sat on a nightstand, a testament to the faith that had sustained him through decades of hardship. His Kentucky Colonel certificate hung proudly on the wall, the document that had given him his name and his identity. The years at Blackwood Hall were the happiest of Harlan Sanders's life. After decades of wandering, after countless failures and fresh starts, he had finally found a home. The mansion became his sanctuary, a place where the relentless demands of fame could be set aside, if only for a moment. Every morning, the Colonel would rise early, a habit forged during those desperate years of farm work and railroad labor. He would dress carefully in his signature white suit, adjust his black string tie, and prepare to face another day as the most famous face in fast food. But first, There was breakfast with Claudia in the sunlit kitchen of Blackwood Hall, a quiet ritual that grounded him before the chaos began. The house hummed with activity during those peak years. Franchisees arrived for training sessions. Journalists came seeking interviews. Photographers captured the Colonel in his natural habitat, surrounded by the trappings of his remarkable success. But when the visitors left and the cameras stopped flashing, Harland and Claudia were simply two people sharing a life they had built together from nothing. The final journey. Even as his health began to fail in the late 1970s, Sanders refused to slow down. He continued traveling over 200,000 miles each year, visiting KFC restaurants, making public appearances, and spreading the gospel of his fried chicken to anyone who would listen. The white suit became slightly rumpled. The famous goatee grew thinner, but the fire in his eyes never dimmed. In June of 1980, doctors delivered the news that would mark the beginning of the end. Harland Sanders had acute leukemia. The diagnosis was devastating, but not entirely surprising. He was nearly 90 years old and had pushed his body relentlessly for decades. The cancer had come to collect what time had not yet taken. Sanders spent the summer and fall of 1980 in and out of hospitals, fighting the disease with the same stubborn determination that had defined his entire life. Between treatments, he continued making appearances, shaking hands, posing for photographs. He refused to let the illness define his final months. If he was going to die, he would die as the Colonel, not as a patient. In early November, he was admitted to Jewish Hospital in Louisville for what would be his final stay. Pneumonia had set in, complicating the leukemia and weakening his already fragile body. Claudia remained by his side, just as she had been for more than 30 years. The children and grandchildren gathered, knowing the end was near. On December 16, 1980, at the age of 90, Colonel Harland David Sanders passed away. The boy who had learned to cook out of necessity, the man who had failed at more jobs than most people ever attempt, the entrepreneur who had built a global empire from a pressure cooker and a dream, was gone. Kentucky mourns its colonel. The news of Sanders's death spread across Kentucky like wildfire. Within hours, flags across the state dropped to half-staff. Governor John Y. Brown, Jr., the same man who had purchased Kentucky Fried Chicken from Sanders 16 years earlier, ordered the colonel's body to lie in state at the Kentucky Capitol Rotunda in Frankfort. It was an honor typically reserved for governors, senators, and fallen soldiers. But Harland Sanders had become something more than a businessman. He had become a symbol of Kentucky itself. The next 3 days became a statewide tribute to a man who had risen from poverty to change the face of American dining. On December 17th, mourners gathered at the Hall Taylor Funeral Home in Shelbyville, his beloved hometown. The colonel lay in an open casket, dressed in his iconic white suit, white shirt, and black string tie. His walking cane was tucked under his right arm, just as it had been in life. Floral arrangements from relatives, friends, and complete strangers lined the walls. Red roses and white chrysanthemums formed a backdrop of color and grief. Claudia led the procession of mourners, followed by their daughters and 19 grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Most of those who filed past the casket were locals, neighbors who had watched the colonel build his empire from the mansion down the road. They came to pay respects not to a celebrity, but to a friend. On December 19th, Sanders' body was moved to KFC headquarters in Louisville, where it lay in state for another day. Over 1,000 employees and admirers passed through to say goodbye. Many had never met the colonel personally, but they had grown up with his face on every bucket of chicken, his image a constant presence in their lives. The funeral service was held on December 20th, at the Alumni Memorial Chapel of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville. More than 1,200 people crowded into the chapel, while others stood outside in the bitter December cold. Governor Brown was there, along with business leaders, celebrities, and ordinary citizens who simply wanted to honor the man who had put Kentucky on the culinary map. At Sanders's personal request, entertainer Pat Boone sang "He Touched Me," a gospel hymn that spoke to the Colonel's deep faith. The pastor read passages about resurrection and eternal life, reminding the congregation that Sanders had never been afraid of death. "Dying doesn't bother me," the Colonel had once said during a visit to his pre-selected gravesite. "I've had a good life. No sucker in the world has had more ups and downs and more pleasure." After the service, a procession of cars wound through Louisville to Cave Hill Cemetery, a historic burial ground where explorer George Rogers Clark and thousands of Civil War soldiers already rested. Sanders was laid to rest beneath a monument featuring 4 columns and a bronze bust, created by his daughter Margaret. He was buried in his characteristic white suit and black string tie, looking in death exactly as he had looked in life. The Colonel was gone, but his legacy was just beginning. Claudia's Vigil. After the funeral, Claudia Sanders returned to Blackwood Hall alone. The house that had once bustled with franchisees and journalists now echoed with silence. The kitchen where Harland had taught his secrets stood empty. The bedroom they had shared for more than 25 years held only memories. But Claudia was not a woman to wallow in grief. She had work to do. The Claudia Sanders Dinner House continued to operate, serving the same Southern comfort food that had made her husband famous. She threw herself into the restaurant, overseeing operations, greeting guests, and ensuring that the quality never slipped. It was her way of keeping Harland alive, of honoring the legacy they had built together. For 4 more years, Claudia remained at Blackwood Hall, maintaining the home and the restaurant with the same dedication she had shown throughout her marriage. But by 1984, she was ready to step back. The mansion held too many memories. The restaurant required energy she no longer possessed, and there were people she trusted to carry on the work. Thomas and Cherry Settle had been close friends and employees of the Sanders family for years. They understood the business, respected the legacy, and shared Claudia's commitment to quality. When she offered to sell them Blackwood Hall and the Claudia Sanders Dinner House, they accepted immediately. The transaction was more than a business deal. It was a passing of the torch. Claudia trusted the Settles to protect what she and Harland had created, to maintain the standards that had made the restaurant famous, and to preserve the memory of the Colonel for generations to come. Claudia moved to a quieter residence in Shelbyville, where she lived until her death on December 31st, 1996, at the age of 94. She was buried beside Harland at Cave Hill Cemetery, her name inscribed on his monument. Together in death as they had been in life, the Colonel and his lady rested beneath the Kentucky sky they had loved so much. The Settles' stewardship. Under Thomas and Cherry Settles' ownership, the Claudia Sanders Dinner House thrived. They kept the menu virtually unchanged, serving the same fried chicken, country ham, fried green tomatoes, and legendary yeast rolls that had drawn customers for decades. The creamed spinach remained a favorite. The pies continued to satisfy sweet tooths from across the region. The restaurant's reputation grew. Food lovers traveled from Louisville, Lexington, and beyond to experience authentic Kentucky cooking in a setting touched by history. Tour buses made regular stops, their passengers eager to dine in the shadow of the Colonel's legacy. The Settles welcomed them all, maintaining the warm hospitality that had always defined the establishment. Inside Blackwood Hall, Time seemed to stand still. The Settles left much of the house as Claudia had left it, preserving the artifacts and memorabilia that told the story of Harlan Sanders's remarkable life. The original stove where he had trained franchisees remained in the kitchen. Photographs and certificates lined the walls. Personal items, from his Bible to his money clip to his wristwatch, stayed exactly where they had always been. The house became a kind of informal museum, a shrine to a man whose face still appeared on millions of chicken buckets around the world. Visitors who came for the food often asked about the house. Could they see inside? Could they touch the stove where the Colonel had cooked? The Settles accommodated when they could, understanding that people craved a connection to the legend. For nearly 50 years, this arrangement continued. The restaurant served hundreds of thousands of meals. The house stood guard over its memories, and the legacy of Colonel Sanders remained alive in the hills of Shelby County. Secrets in the walls. As the years passed, the Settles made an astonishing discovery. Blackwood Hall was not just a home, it was a treasure chest. Tucked away in closets, hidden in drawers, and stored in boxes throughout the mansion were artifacts that had never been catalogued, never been displayed, and in some cases, never been seen by anyone outside the family. The Colonel and Claudia had been collectors without really trying, accumulating the detritus of a remarkable life and simply leaving it wherever it landed. There was a letter from President Richard Nixon wishing the Colonel a happy birthday. There was the original Kentucky Colonel certificate, the document that had given Harlan Sanders his famous title back in 1935. There was the first pressure cooker he had used to perfect his chicken recipe, the very device that had revolutionized fast food preparation. The discoveries kept coming. The Settles found the original KFC flag that had once flown in front of the Shelbyville headquarters. They found one of the first Kentucky Fried Chicken buckets, a primitive ancestor of the containers now used billions of times each year. They found signed guest books from Blackwood Hall's glory days, filled with the names of franchisees, celebrities, and ordinary visitors who had made the pilgrimage to the Colonel's home. But perhaps the most intriguing find was a reel of film, 20 minutes and 18 seconds long, dated 1965. The label read simply, "Promotion, Kentucky Style." No one knew what it contained. No one had watched it in decades. The film remained sealed, waiting for someone to unlock its secrets. These artifacts were not just souvenirs. They were pieces of American history, tangible connections to a story that had shaped the way the world eats, and they would all eventually be offered to whoever was brave enough to take on the Colonel's legacy. A fire and a rebirth. On a spring night in 1999, disaster struck. A fire broke out in the Claudia Sanders dinner house, spreading quickly through the building that had once served as KFC's warehouse and headquarters. Flames consumed the dining room, the kitchen, and decades of accumulated memories. By the time firefighters brought the blaze under control, the original structure was gone. But the Settles refused to let the fire end the story. They rebuilt the restaurant on the same property, constructing a new building that could seat even more guests than before. The new Claudia Sanders dinner house rose from the ashes, a phoenix carrying forward the legacy of the original. The menu remained unchanged. The recipes, safely preserved, continued to guide the kitchen. The spirit of Southern hospitality that Harlan and Claudia had cultivated survived the flames. Within months, the restaurant was serving customers again, as if the fire had never happened. Blackwood Hall itself escaped the fire unscathed. The mansion stood apart from the restaurant, protected by distance and fortune. The artifacts inside remained safe, the memories preserved. Whatever else might change, the Colonel's home would endure. The 21st century beckoned. The world that had created Harlan Sanders was long gone. The gas stations and roadside diners of the 1930s had given way to interstate highways and fast food chains. The America that had made Kentucky Fried Chicken a phenomenon had evolved into something the Colonel might not recognize. But at Blackwood Hall, the past remained present, a legacy for sale. In the summer of 2022, news broke that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. The Colonel Sanders estate, Blackwood Hall, and the Claudia Sanders dinner house were going up for sale. The Settles, now elderly themselves, had decided it was time to pass the torch once more. They had protected the legacy for nearly 40 years, maintaining the restaurant and preserving the mansion through fires and economic downturns and changing tastes. But the work of stewardship is exhausting, and they were ready for someone else to carry the burden. The listing was extraordinary. Buyers would acquire not just the 5,000 square foot mansion and the 25,000 square foot restaurant. They would also receive the trademark and likeness rights to the Claudia Sanders name. They would inherit all of the memorabilia that had been discovered over the decades, from Nixon's birthday letter to the original Kentucky Colonel certificate to that mysterious reel of film. And they would receive the recipes. Not the famous 11 herbs and spices of Kentucky Fried Chicken, which belonged to KFC and its corporate parent, but the recipes for everything else the Claudia Sanders dinner house served. The yeast rolls and the creamed spinach and the fried green tomatoes that had made the restaurant a destination for half a century. These recipes, handwritten by Claudia herself, were included in the sale. The asking price was $9 million. Interested buyers had to demonstrate at least $5 million in liquid assets just to begin the conversation. Priority would be given to those committed to preserving the legacy, keeping the long-term employees, and continuing the traditions that Harlan and Claudia had established. Phone calls poured in from around the world. The Colonel's fame had spread far beyond Kentucky, far beyond America. Inquiries came from Japan, where KFC had become a Christmas tradition. They came from Canada, where Sanders had maintained his franchise rights until the end. They came from Malaysia, from Europe, from everywhere the Colonel's face had appeared on a bucket of chicken. The listing agents were overwhelmed. They had known that Harlan Sanders was a global icon, but they had not fully grasped the depth of devotion his memory still commanded. People were not just interested in buying a restaurant. They wanted to own a piece of history, to become the custodians of a legend. What remains? Today, the Claudia Sanders Dinner House still operates in Shelbyville, Kentucky. It serves the same menu it has served for more than 50 years, prepared according to recipes that predate the fast food revolution. Customers still order fried chicken and country ham and those legendary yeast rolls. They still finish their meals with pie, just as diners did when the Colonel himself walked the dining room floor. Blackwood Hall still stands beside the restaurant, its white facade gleaming against the Kentucky hills exactly as it did when Harlan and Claudia first saw it in 1959. The original stove remains in the kitchen. The memorabilia lines the walls. The spirit of the Colonel seems to linger in every room, a presence that cannot quite be explained but cannot be denied. The mansion has become more than just a house. It has become a symbol of what is possible when determination meets opportunity, when failure becomes fuel for success, when an old man with a pressure cooker and a dream refuses to accept defeat. Visitors who make the pilgrimage to Shelbyville often stand in the parking lot for a moment before entering the restaurant. They look at the mansion, They imagine the Colonel standing on that porch, watching the sun set over his Kentucky home. They try to connect the global brand they know, the face on billions of buckets, with the humble reality of this quiet property on the outskirts of a small town. The connection is not always easy to make. Kentucky Fried Chicken has become KFC, a streamlined brand optimized for the modern age. The company that Harlan Sanders built has changed hands multiple times, passing from investors to corporations to multinational conglomerates. The chicken itself has evolved, adapting to new tastes and new markets and new demands. But here in Shelbyville, something original survives. The Claudia Sanders Dinner House serves chicken made the way the Colonel believed it should be made, without corporate shortcuts or efficiency experts or focus groups. It is the only restaurant outside of KFC authorized to serve his original recipe, a living link to the source of the phenomenon. And Blackwood Hall stands watch, just as it has for more than 60 years. The mansion that became a headquarters, that witnessed the birth of an empire, that sheltered the Colonel in his final years, refuses to surrender to time. The meaning of the mansion. What does a house mean when the people who built it are gone? What remains when the laughter fades and the arguments end and the kitchen grows cold? For Blackwood Hall, the answer lies not in architecture or real estate value. It lies in the story the walls contain. Every room in that mansion whispers of a journey that should have been impossible. A boy loses his father at 5 and learns to cook out of necessity. A man fails at job after job, never finding his place in the world. An entrepreneur watches his successful restaurant destroyed by a highway and faces ruin at 65. And then, impossibly, triumph emerges from the wreckage. The mansion is proof that the story was real. It is tangible evidence that Harlan Sanders existed, that he lived and worked and dreamed in this specific place. When visitors touch the original stove, they are touching the same metal the Colonel touched. When they walk the halls, they are walking where he walked. The connection across time is physical, undeniable. This is why people care about old houses. This is why preservation matters. Buildings are not just shelter. They are containers for memory, vessels that carry the past into the present. Blackwood Hall carries the memory of a man who refused to quit, who turned disaster into opportunity, who proved that success has no age limit. The legacy continues. Harlan Sanders died more than 4 decades ago, but his legacy shows no signs of fading. KFC now operates more than 27,000 restaurants in over 145 countries. The Colonel's face appears on signs and buckets and advertisements in languages he never learned, in places he never visited. His image has become one of the most recognized symbols on Earth, rivaling Mickey Mouse and the Golden Arches for global awareness. But the true legacy is not measured in restaurants or revenue. It is measured in the lives he touched, the opportunities he created, the example he set. Harlan Sanders showed the world that it is never too late to start over. He proved that failure is not final, that setbacks are just setups for comebacks, that persistence and belief can overcome any obstacle. His story has inspired millions of entrepreneurs, particularly those who feel they have missed their chance. When a 50-year-old wonders if it is too late to pursue a dream, the Colonel's example provides an answer. When a 60-year-old faces financial ruin and despair, the Colonel's journey offers hope. When anyone, anywhere feels that the best years are behind them, the Colonel's life stands as a reminder that the best may still be ahead. At Blackwood Hall, that legacy takes physical form. The mansion is more than just a historic property. It is a monument to perseverance, a temple of second chances. A reminder that greatness can emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. The Colonel's final message. Before he died, Harlan Sanders asked that mourners express their sympathy not through flowers, but through contributions to charity. He had given away millions during his lifetime, funding children's hospitals and scholarships and causes he believed in. He wanted his death to continue that tradition of generosity. It was a fitting final request from a man who had known both poverty and wealth, who understood that money means nothing unless it serves a purpose. The Colonel had spent the first half of his life struggling to survive. He spent the second half building something larger than himself, and he wanted his departure from this world to leave it a little better than he found it. That same spirit lives on at Blackwood Hall. The mansion and the restaurant beside it are not just businesses. They are living tributes to a philosophy of hard work, quality, and genuine care for others. The employees who serve customers at the Claudia Sanders Dinner House are carrying forward a tradition that stretches back nearly a century. The guests who enjoy the food are participating in a ritual that connects them to the Colonel himself. And somewhere in those quiet rooms, among the memorabilia and the memories, the spirit of Harlan Sanders seems to linger still. Not as a ghost, but as an idea. As proof that one person, with enough determination, can change the world. The sun sets over Kentucky. As evening falls over Shelbyville, the lights of the Claudia Sanders Dinner House glow warmly against the darkening sky. Inside, families gather around tables laden with fried chicken and country ham. Conversations blend with the clink of silverware and the soft background music. Laughter rises and falls like the Kentucky hills themselves. Across the parking lot, Blackwood Hall stands silent. The windows are dark. The porch is empty, but the house does not feel abandoned. It feels like it is waiting for someone to understand what it represents, waiting for someone to carry the story forward, waiting, as the Colonel himself waited during those desperate franchise years, for the right moment to begin again. The mansion has witnessed nearly 2 centuries of history now. From the aftermath of the Civil War through the Great Depression, the fast food revolution, and into the digital age. It has sheltered families and entrepreneurs and legends. It has seen triumph and tragedy, success and failure, life and death. And still it stands. Still it waits. Still it holds the memory of a man in a white suit who refused to accept that his story was over. That is the legacy of Blackwood Hall. That is the meaning of Colonel Sanders's Shelbyville estate. Not just bricks and mortar and antique stoves, but hope, perseverance, the unshakable belief that it is never, ever too late. The Colonel knew it, and now, perhaps, so do you.